Greetings, this is Craig Pepin, Project Lead for the Davis Grant. Thank you for listening to this audio recording from the Spring 2024 Competency Fellows Workshop Series. These workshops are funded by a grant from the Davis Educational Foundation, and together with other materials funded by the grant and available on the Competencies website, are designed to help enhance your understanding and learning of Champlain's college competencies. Today's workshop, titled Let's Put the U in GCU, is led by Mike Lange, our Global and Cultural Understanding Fellow.
Hi to folks in virtual land. I want this to be conversational. So everybody online, go ahead and unmute and just pitch in when you got something to say. I don't know if Craig's going to be monitoring the hands up sort of function. And since there aren't that many of us, I think it's kind of clumsy to kind of click the hands up. So let's just say stuff when you've got stuff to say. That's kind of how I'd like to roll. The global and cultural understanding. The U is understanding. And that is, as it turns out, one of the kind of sticking points for understanding its competency. A lot of people in my experience have a hard time kind of seeing the difference, seeing the space in between GCU and DEI. The idea of GCU and DEI seem to sort of overlap in a lot of folks' minds in some kind of fuzzy being nice to people sort of realm. So what I want to do is start the conversation with the space in between, trying to figure out what is GCU that makes it different from DEI, to really get a handle on what the competency is all about. And then subsequent work, later semesters, later years, we can kind of dig into the hows and whys. But I wanted to start with really what it is. And I actually want to start with y'all. What makes GCU different from DEI in your understanding right now? What do you think?
Well, I think it's more of, DEI, I would say, be a framework for how we would want to operate in our day-to-day, right? Bringing in diversity, equity, inclusion into our lives. For global and cultural understanding, in my mind, it's more like understanding various cultures, understanding how we all, different countries work together and operate, right? And then just understanding that different cultures have different ways of operating, right? I think that would be my overview, whereas the other one seems more interpersonal.
Okay, and if I could sort of tease out a little bit, is a sense of scale a fair way to capture? Like DEI feels like it's me operating in kind of the world that I immediately experience and act, and GCU feels sort of larger scale, or am I oversimplifying?
Maybe. I guess it's more that like in DEI, it's more interpersonal skill related, right? And then global and cultural understanding is really just understanding the world and how it operates. So maybe it's scale, but I also think it's a different kind of set skill that you're trying to, or different things that you're thinking about in addition.
That's fair. Other folks, what do y'all think?
GCU seems to be more intellectual and DEI tends to be more behavioral. It's echoing, I think, what Rachel said, and one of the ones. It seems that you can't do good work in the GCU field without cultural understanding. But you can probably do some reasonable work trying to understand cultures without having a very strong behavioral background in DEI. That would be sort of how I look at it.
Sure. Other folks.
Sorry, I'm probably not hearing right. So are you saying that the GCU is more theoretical?
Not necessarily theoretical in the sense of being abstract, but more generalizable. It's about more the understanding aspect. Like you can understand something without internalizing it or believing it or acting on it. Whereas DEI is generally about behaving and action and sort of instrumentalizing that, at least in my understanding. It's all oversimplification way.
So I was saying that the global awareness can be put through a filter of morality or ethics.
Sure, you could be a horrible person and have great cultural understanding, probably.
Except I wonder about that.
That's a good point.
Because, I was with you, and then all of a sudden I thought about it in reverse, and was like, well, hold on a minute. Is it possible to have a good global cultural understanding without understanding equity? Right?
understanding but then rejecting it, perhaps.
Right. Well, that's why I guess that's the next question. Can you figure out understanding DEI without actually bringing it into your behavior? I mean, I think in theory that's possible as well.
Yeah, possibly. Certainly possible.
Unlikely.
Yeah.
This is a hand from a moderator.
I've got another frame for it. This team from talking with Jonathan Danfield this 2 hours ago nearby, so global cultural saying that in some ways DEI is sort of direct outgrowth of the specific American context. Slavery, legacy, segregation, and various other animosity towards racial groups.
You think that's an American thing?
Yeah, the way that it's often conceptualized in America is it's sort of a specific response to a specifically American set of concerns.
I mean, because hypothetically, right, other cultures, other countries are working on the same thing. Like, West Africa, they have horrible problems between, one tribe thinking they're better than another tribe. The tribe has dominance, beats the crap out of another tribe. And the Yoruba are notorious for that, right? No shade, but it's true, right? And same thing with the English and the travelers or the Romani, right? I mean, it's everywhere, and there's justice, these kinds of equity when it comes to queer folks and stuff like that. These are global movements. So maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying about that.
But the conception of them is not global. That's the thing.
It's not?
Yeah. No, I agree with what
You don't think that other countries are thinking of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
They may be using that term, but what they mean by it varies. The way they taxonomize groups and the way they understand power relationships is not universal. And so it is very culturally contextualized, culturally specific.
Use the same words sometimes if you don't mean the same things. Living in Europe, watching how Germans, for instance, handle these sort of questions. Using oftentimes the same language, very different ways of actually acting on the ground.
Well, folks online, what are y'all thinking about at this point?
It looks like Meg has a comment.
Yeah.
In the chat.
Yeah, I was just saying that I think I'm somewhere between what's being said. The issues that we face here in the U.S. are not U.S. specific. The issues themselves are global, but the discourses that we use around them and the way we talk about DEI and what kind of comes forward is very location specific. I was saying in the chat that I gave a DEI workshop in a European country, and I was some consider a pretty equitable country, and I was met with just blank faces because they don't talk about racism. They consider it not existing in their country, but they do very much have that issue. So it's just same issues, different ways of talking about it, and different things that come forward and different things that move towards the back, kind of.
Yeah, and this is one of the biggest spaces in between GCI as we have it here at Champlain and DEI as we have here at Champlain. Is that the one is couched in, you two are both getting at a big meaty part of it. It's couched in an understanding. There's an idea of there's a thing there for me to wrap my intellectual mind around. The other one is couched in advocacy. Let me do something about this. Let me take a stance on. Let me engage in the should be's or shouldn't be's as a result of. The analytical part travels better. I'm not going to say it's universal. It's not. Nothing is. Culture doesn't work that way. But the frameworks to understand and analyze travel and transpose across cultural boundaries, across epistemological boundaries, much more readily. Advocative frames don't. They don't because they require the local engagement that you were talking about, that idea of how does this become lived reality in my experience, not just a reality that some people lived. And when you get to that level, the local contexts, all of the layers and the complexities of them refuse to take a back seat. They never do. So because all that locality is inherently necessarily part of the advocative application, DEI becomes a different thing in different places, even if they're using the same kind of terminology. And a lot of the blank stares, I wasn't at whatever talk you were talking about, Meg, but I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that some of the blank stares were translational issues. And I don't mean linguistic translation. It's, oh, you're talking about this, and that's not what that means here, kind of thing. Would that be a fair statement to make?
Oh, absolutely. They don't even really use the term equity. They still use equality. And so anytime I said equity, we had to kind of unpack the difference between those.
Yeah. Yeah. Anytime you cross an epistemological boundary, it requires translation. GCU requires less translating. DEI requires more translating. And I think that's one of the reasons that GCU and DEI here at Champlain often kind of get muddled, is that we don't recognize that the one needs more translation. We think of it as universal, and it's not. Neither of them is. But the one is a lot closer to more broadly shared. GCU. DEI is less broadly shared. We don't recognize that. And we don't pay attention to the advocative aspect, the particularity, the taking into account all the vernacular expression and contextualization that it's going to need to be put into a particular context, even if that context is from one division of the school to the other. Whereas GCU has a bit more easy translatability. Again, not universal, but it's easier to translate. And one of the reasons for that, the primary reason for that, is something, Bob, you're touched on. If we think of a spectrum between advocacy and analysis, like many academics, I'm just making up a spectrum and saying this is sort of useful. But if we pretend that that is a linear spectrum, starting from a position of advocacy and moving toward a position of analysis is very difficult to do. Starting from a position of analysis and moving toward advocacy is much, much easier. A big part because of that local translatability or comparative lack thereof. And that is the U in GCU. It's about understanding. It's about the analytical side of that spectrum. Whereas DEI is inherently an advocative thing. It is about the shoulds. It's about the what do we want to be rather than what is. And if we pull these two competencies apart on that basis, kind of with that framing, knowing that they're not separate, none of them is. I mean, all this is done through communication. So that competencies, they're all intertwined. We know that. But if we look for the separability, not separation, but separability, so we can wrap our minds around it based on the spectrum of advocacy versus analysis, then we can begin to understand, I think, a little bit better how to do the U and GCU, how to gain understandings. And again, this is something you were sort of touching on, is if we understand from a more, I'm going to use the word distant, and I'm going to put a little asterisk next to that. I'll go back to each second. But from a more distant kind of analytical stance, then we can bring out all sorts of intellectual tools, theories, in order to try to figure out what's going on over there. If we then want to take a stance on that, hey, what should be going on over there, we can do that. But only if we start at the understanding and move toward the advocative. And I put the little asterisk next to distance, because that word and that concept scares the living crap out of a lot of people at Champlain for reasons that I still don't fully understand. The idea that we can try to wrap our minds around something without taking a stance on it is something that a lot of people here, students, staff, faculty, administration, find difficult to do. We must do a thing about, we must feel rather than just understand. Feeling's great if you start with understanding and then you feel through well-contextualized lenses. But the idea of just engaging in order to understand is something that my students fight against for a good 5 weeks every semester, regardless of class level. And I have to kind of, wrestle with them intellectually to get them to the point of, understanding in order to do whatever you want to do is actually a useful thing to do, because they don't want to pull apart the advocacy and the analysis. I just want to know what the answer is. Well, it turns out when you're talking about global and cultural, very often there isn't an answer. There are just ways. There are culture contextualized ways of doing things. And so in order to understand those, we need tools, theories. We need theory lenses to wrap minds around what is the global? What is the culture? What does it mean to understand a culture that is other than ours? And at this,
I just want to define something. What is our culture?
there is no specific our. It's whoever is thinking. It's from their standpoint. Yeah, I'm not defining our. There's
Yeah, I was just curious.
no. It's
What the assumption?
yeah. It's fair. Sure. You're afraid. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, this actually points out a hugely important part of this is our. I kind of wish I had a whiteboard or chalkboard. The tools that I'm talking about, the theories I'm talking about, they are. I also use that interchangeably with the word epistemologies. Our frames, the ways that we make knowledge and meaning. And oftentimes when I'm teaching epistemology to my students, I'll draw them. And I draw a little circle and a stick figure human being, and then a big circle around it. And that big circle around it is the important one. That's the boundary between what that epistemology is capable of knowing and what that epistemology is not capable of knowing. All of our ways of thinking, all of our frames, they have outer limits. They have things that they are not capable. It's not about known and unknown. It's knowable and unknowable. And all of our epistemologies, even I was about to say, even the ones that think they're universal, most of them think they're universal. But even the ones that think they're universal, they have outer edges. They have things they're incapable of knowing. But more importantly, in response to Kel, what you're asking, we're always in the middle. We're the stick figure human being in the middle of it, looking outward at that which is not us. Okay. And that framing, that positionality is vitally important to keep in mind. That's one of the reasons that positionality is, if you take a look at the rubrics, positionality is talked about explicitly in the rubric. That's one of the reasons. Understanding without paying attention to our relative position to that which we're trying to understand is a fool's errand. We want to wrap our minds around the fact that we are in the middle of something trying to look out. Now, it is possible to remove yourself from the center of the epistemology. That's incredibly difficult and takes an awful lot of training, and it's probably not something we can realistically expect from what we do here. But being aware that we're in the middle of it and looking outward is, I think, a valuable step. That's something we can attain. That's something we can reach for. What are other theory tools? What are other lenses that you all either do, if this is something you engage in sort of actively in your teaching, or things that you think could be used to do this sort of analyzing that which is outside of our epistemologies? Yeah.
So this is going to be a reach, but I'm thinking a lot about the dialogue and deliberation process. There's a lot of communication theorists and rhetoricians and stuff spend time talking about dialogue and the deliberation and those things being separable but connected. And the dialogue space is about openness, respect, storytelling, deep listening, suspending automatic response, judgment, certainty, finding common ground, exploring differences stuff. That's the phase of inquiry. And then the deliberative process is the advocacy piece, so that's where I'm hearing what you're saying is, so that the deliberation being about evaluating alternatives and giving reasons and re-examining your preferences and seeking agreement and making decisions. Does that make any sense whatsoever?
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, and an important piece of that is the dialogue, because it requires, if understood fully, it requires an understanding that there's a here and a there that are coming into contact with one another. Mm-hmm. And the point at which they're coming into contact is the outer edge of each of their epistemologies. Okay. That point where two epistemologies meet is what Anna Singer refers to as friction. It's point of friction. Mm-hmm. Friction, I mean, just think about what friction is in physics. You rub two sticks together and it can make yourself a fire to toast your marshmallows and make you a nice warm dinner.
Or burn your house down.
Or burn your damn house down. Exactly. Friction is what Singer refers to as awkward, unequal, unstable, and creative. It's the and creative part that we often forget about. We think of friction as just a bad thing. Well, it's a great thing when I'm trying to stop my car when it's rolling downhill. It's a bad thing when my brakes fail and I hit a tree. It's the same friction in both cases, though. It can create, it can destroy. But the awkwardness, the unequalness, the instability of it allows the creativity, the things to be made. Whether that making looks like this or looks like this, that can vary. and it could look different from either side of that same process to different people. But the idea of the dia in dialogue is an explicit acknowledgement that there is an epistemology here and there's an epistemology there, and they are communicating across each other. Now, how does translation come into that frame when you're talking about the kind of the mediation standpoint? The idea of getting the understandings from that end to this end, and vice versa.
Are you talking about what are the skills that take us from one of those places to another?
Just the awarenesses of the need to translate.
And sometimes the possibility of translate. Well, I mean, I think there's an element of intellectual humility that's trying to be cultivated. Maybe that's an awareness of the space we are in and the awareness of the boundaries.
Absolutely. When you're first responding to my question, you talked about part of this process being, I forget how you phrase it, something like avoiding or refusing or rejecting strong definition, seeking more kind of shareable understandings rather than kind of definitionally saying that this is actually why. Am I understanding you correctly? That was part of the mediatory process?
Yeah.
Ontology defines. Epistemology describes. To approach epistemologically, to be satisfied with description and not need definition is humble. It requires humility.
Can you repeat what you just said?
Ontology defines. Epistemology describes.
Yeah, it's the next sentence about
To be satisfied with.
To be satisfied with just describing and not needy of definition requires humility. It requires me to say, the way that I can describe this may be useful to me, but it's not the definition. In my mind, anyway, I'm just going to describe this is the more humble stance, because I don't need my definition to be your definition. I just need it to be a thing that works for me to help me, GCU, understand.
When you just talk about definition, what you're in some ways also getting at is ascribing values too. It's value judgment, such as, defining it's locating on sort of a value spectrum. Because I think that one of the things you're talking about and what's really key is GCU is sort of being able to understand that the way we approach anybody, approach something that's not us, is carrying with it those epistemologies and those viewpoints, and to understand that we have to sort of identify first and then try to understand the different epistemologies that work in it from another perspective. So a simple example is individual versus collective practice. Many of us, oftentimes when we look at other cultures level, our first lens is how would I feel in here? What does this do for an individual? Whereas in many other cases, if you go organically to wherever we're talking about, whatever we're talking about, the epistemology may be centered more on the collective, it may de-value. Those are two very distinct sort of epistemologies that color everything about the rest of our interpretation. And so being able to say, okay, from this perspective, assuming that I understand this as this, right? As opposed to, wow, those people are weird. Don't they understand that this is really bad for this, for the individual? That's a simple example, but see, it gets in.
It does, and it gets to kind of the flip side of the humility, which is vulnerability. Ontologies aren't vulnerable; they're ironclad. Now I'm overstating things, but from a standpoint of GCU, if I define what's going on over there, I'm building walls around my thought process, and I gain comfort in doing so. But if I'm approaching it through a kind of framework of, well, here's a way to describe in a epistemological frame, that requires me to be vulnerable to say, oh, another reality might actually be valid. Maybe even more valid than mine, maybe even more out there.
Fighting against dominant epistemology. We look at traditional academic epistemology and sort of worldview that encourages you to be definitive. yet to actually do the work, like in anthropology or in any sort of reaching out and understanding the other, you have to have that humility that mitigates against that. You can't be definitive in the same way. So you have to navigate that friction. We find in politics, find in other aspects too, that we're pressed to do certain things.
Well, and you find it at Champlain in no small dog too, because this is one of the ways which Champlain actually acts like other academia, that our identities are so wrapped up in the things that we teach, the header on our degree, or the field that we're in, or the program that we teach, or whatever it may be, that that becomes ontologically safe. Mm-hmm. And the vulnerability of saying, well, no, there's another way to do, is difficult to come by, not just for our students. It's a challenge.
Can I just clarify that when you talked about epistemology, thinking about your diagram, the individual and circle, are we talking about thinking about epistemologies as individual ways of knowing the world versus ways of knowing the world?
They are. It's an excellent question for which I don't have the short answer, so I'm going to give you the long answer. They are enacted individually, they are shareable. But even if I call my epistemology the same as your epistemology, even if we have the same term for it, there are going to be particularities to you as an individual that's going to mean your enactment of it, at the very least, is different from mine.
So in your visual, you always have a single individual within a circle. You don't have a group within that circle.
Correct. People's circles could look coterminous, especially as a scaling a little bit. But identical on.
So if you overlay them, you'd see they look from a distance, they look the same, but as you get closer, you'd see they actually overlap and shift.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that you've got this, one of the reasons I can't answer that question straightforwardly is because our epistemologies are enacted through our habitus. The quick and dirty definition for habitus is a set of norms, values, experiences, education, knowledge that we use when we epistemologize. The metaphor that I like to use to describe is, are you all familiar with Play-Doh?
Never heard.
And I mean Play-Doh, the stuff, not Plato, the philosopher. Play-Doh, the goo. Do y'all know remember the Play-Doh factory?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, it's an injection molded plastic thing. You tickle up the Play-Doh, you put it in a hopper in the top, and you squish it.
Hard to clean.
I never cleaned those. Actually, we never had them. The halls down the street did. But you push it down, and it squeezes the Play-Doh out the bottom, and it gives it a particular shape, right? If you think about that lump of Play-Doh before you drop it in as some new cultural artifact, something you run into. And when I say artifact, I don't just mean physical. It could be an idea, it could be a word, it could be anything. You need to decide what that means to you, what that is to you. You need to epistemologize it. So you drop it in your epistemology, and that little screen at the front of Play-Doh factory that has different shapes cut out of it, that's your habitus. You go into that storehouse of norms, values, experiences, and education, things that you have with you, and you decide what is applicable to this phenomenon, this cultural artifact. What can I use as comparative model, as web of significance, to use Clifford Geertz's term, to decide this means this to me? And you then, I say choose, it's 99 times out of 100 not a conscious process. But we go through some sort of, at the very least, subconscious selective process, and you slide that little screen into a particular position, and then give that cultural artifact shape. So because my habitus is going to have stuff in it that yours doesn't, and yours has that mine doesn't, that's where the individual enactment comes in, even if we are using the same epistemology.
And so to go back to what you were saying before, I can either say, look, I have this shape that has 5 points on it and it's fat in the middle, or I could say, I have a star, and one is an logical and one is epistemology. One is describing, one is defining, but either way, they're coming from your habitus. They're coming from this lens.
Yeah.
But people have multiple lenses, multiple appetite.
I honestly don't know what the plural is, because it's translated from sociology.
I think it should be habituses.
That's often what I go with. Habit.
It's my effort to simplify.
But you're on top of it. Whether we want a more descriptive or a more definitional framework is also going to be part of our haptics. Our experiences, our values, that's part of our haptics. So if what I value is definition, I'm going to want my meaning is also the meaning you should be using. And if you're using a different one, oh, that might be quaint at best, but that's just because you don't know my meaning. If I teach you my meaning, colonialism, then I can bring us into the same understanding. So, and that's where power comes into play. If I decide my meanings are more important than your meanings, and I do some economic, linguistic, military, whatever process to make my meanings your meanings, well, then that's what colonialism is. And that's all it is. That's incredibly powerful. Yeah.
So it's teaching for needs.
Yep. It can be if it's strongly ontological. If it is framed through a lens of epistemologies, it's at the very least less close. All of the good research about decolonizing teaching and things, if you scrape through them, what you'll see is be more epistemological, less ontological.
What?
Why is that a good thing to do? Why is that what's at the root?
If that's what ontology is, that thing is to describe a network. Oh,
Epistemology is to describe.
okay.
So teaching is a process of friction. It's epistemologies coming in contact with one another. Now, there is an undeniable power dynamic in a classroom. There's one person typically standing at the front of the classroom who has more power because they've got the grade book either in their hand or under their keyboard. To pretend otherwise is, again, a fool's errand. But that doesn't, we shouldn't throw out the baby with that bathwater because recognizing that it is that colonizing, or at least has that potential to be a colonizing process, if it is too unquestionably and critically ontological, can allow us to do it better, to cultivate epistemological meaning-making understanding, the U and GCU, rather than trying to kind of present, well, here are, that's classic lecture. And I mean, that's not the only thing that does that, but it's, here are facts, write them in the blue book at the end. Champlain rails against that, and I think rightly so. One of the things we define ourselves as is not that, and I think that's why.
So I got to point to the elements of well, I would say it's defined. We've little specifically, but
I gave away my copy.
Self-understanding and understanding others.
Yeah.
Okay. What are some of the ways that you can enact that or cultivate that in the classroom? Some methods by which we how our teach people.
The first thing we can do is teach the separation between advocacy and analysis. Because teach the separation between advocacy and analysis, so that students understand that they are separable processes. Again, not separate, separable, and that doing the one first and doing the other second leads to better results. And then teaching how people make knowledge and meaning. Because self-awareness, awareness of others, those are meanings that we construct and assign. Pull them away from the ontological. Now that, in many ways, is the biggest lift of a semester, especially for first year and second year students at Champlain, because they want ontological surety. They want the comfort of just telling me what the right answer is. Every semester I have students say that exact sentence, just tell me what the answer is. No. And you have to be that blunt, that forceful, because partly they want to see it as, well, you're just playing intellectual games with me. But partly so much of their educational experience up to that point has been ontologically driven. They are used to ontological surety. They are more to the point, they are not used to the humility and the vulnerability it takes to approach epistemology.
The epistemological framework that shapes most education in the United States is itself one of the privileges. So it is an epistemology, there are different educational epistemologies, and what we're trying to do in our classroom, hopefully, is adopt different ones.
That's the goal. Yeah. But education for so many of them feels like ontological repetition, recreation, and so you have to teach them how to be vulnerable, the kind of vulnerability that lets them really, a lot of people will talk about it in terms of you have to teach your students how to fail so they can learn how to succeed. That's part of it, absolutely. But the other part is they have to, this is going to sound counterintuitive given vocabulary of humility and vulnerability, but they have to learn they have intellectual power, that they are knowledge makers, not just information pointer outers. Because ontology is easy to point at. And, oh, okay, I pointed at the right one, give me an A. But if what they are supposed to do is be humble and vulnerable in order to engage and try to create understandings through theory lenses, then they need to learn how to be vulnerable. And it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying for a lot of them because they're so used to having those nice, neat, comfortable ontological walls built around them. So start with advocacy versus analysis, and then talk about how to be vulnerable and intellectually humble.
So does that suggest that, again, if let's first start criteria, one is self-analysis, analysis, result beyond yourself. Would you say that it's easier to get the analysis beyond yourself than self-analysis?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is one of the big downfalls of the old version of core is it started with self. The self is the hardest thing to be critical about because you want your understanding of yourself to be ontological. I really know me, as opposed to there are possible ways to understand me. Talk about vulnerable, talk about terrifying. It's a terrible place to start. Getting the idea that things are potentially subject to analysis, and then, oh, I'm a thing too. That's a much better way to once you equip them with a toolkit to be able to analyze, and then cultivate that toolkit to the point of a certain level of intellectual comfort doing it, and then say, okay, now how about us? Let's take a look at ourselves. It's much less threatening because they go through the process of analyzing through theory lenses and gain the humility and vulnerability and the intellectual power of saying, oh, I can actually say something useful about that thing that's outside of me. There's an incredible validation that comes from that. And once they're feeling like valid knowledge makers, not just information pointer outers, then it's much easier. It's still not easy, but it's much easier to get them looking at themselves. And that's where, to get back to one of the places you started yesterday, analyzing culture is simultaneously this scale and this scale. I know that I put scale on what you were saying. I'm not saying your name, but the idea of my lived realities then become understandable in a whole different way once I have learned how to understand on this scale. And so decisions about DEI, ones that are more advocatively focused, I can get to more easily because I'm able to analyze, oh, I interact with this person in that way because once they're able to get to do that, then they can say, hey, maybe I want not to do that. Or, hey, maybe I'm really proud of doing that. That's something I'm going to double down on. But doing that more thoughtfully is an end goal, but there are several steps to get from here to there.
Thank you. Perfect.
I'm just being mindful of time. I want to get back to positionality because that was something we touched on earlier, and that's, again, part of the rubric. Positionality is talked about. If you look in the cultural awareness exemplary criterion, builds upon analysis one's own positionality by analyzing actions, multiple perspectives, etc. It's the big green box on the exemplars. How does positionality become understandable through this humility, vulnerability, looking through theory lenses, cultivating an ability to analyze and then turning to itself? Because positionality is inherently about self, or at least when we're talking about culture self, whereas it's my positionality that we want students to pay attention to. So how can their positionality then become understandable through this process? How can all the stuff that I'm hearing about help a student do that is really what the question is.
It's not what Craig just asked you.
Yeah, but I've already got my grades. Partly, yeah. So reiterate specifically about positionality.
Things you can apply the tools towards self. get an understanding of ourselves. Then it familiarizes us with them and makes it hopefully more easier or faster to apply the notes, but we also validate them in a sense because we now have a better understanding of things through our own personality. And once we recognize this and accurate, the sense we know or it's something that we recognize or go identify with, then we can use those tools elsewhere with confidence, I think, in some lines. And I think to do it other to self makes sense because we don't have as much invested at first. So there's that could be even less resistance and less fear, yet being more able, having more ability, more openness that way before we work on the big problem, which is dealing with ourselves.
Ideally, although as we're keeping in mind, I mean, you're absolutely right, but time scale becomes something to pay attention to here because this is not going to be achievable within a 15-week semester in one class. This is something to cultivate over a few years, a few semesters at the very least. So getting there step by step is absolutely possible.
But I teach classes that have a GCU component to it or substantial. I think you have to sort of prioritize and triage, but what I tend to do is that analytical aspect of sort of understanding. If you have something that you identify as you don't understand why this would be or why you would do this, to start with that and then unpack all the stuff around it to get to the point of where when it starts to make sense, as this is no longer an aberration, this is a natural outgrowth of certain conditions, decisions.
And part of what you're talking about is another term from the context, that unpacking all the stuff around it. How many times have you heard a student say something along the lines of, "Oh, wow, that's random"? They want to attribute something they don't understand to randomness.
It's never random.
No, never is. It's contextual. But information feels random because it's dislocated.
And the more information you have, the more random things feel. And that's another problem today is the technology intersects with this. We have the tools to do better than ever before, but those very tools made it more complicated. It made it much more difficult for us to actually do it.
We've got the tools to do the G and the C well, not the U.
Well,
that's the problem. We've got the ability to access information from all over the place, but that knowledge-making process, the humble, vulnerable part, the part that takes more work, we are less equipped to do so. And part of it is because information is now the top level thing that our students want to think about. And it's not just our students.
Puts us at the center, and information serves us, and it is sort of like resource you consume, and we are still at the center of it. The fighting is not an epistemology that encourages broad view of information or imagine view.
Well, it's one that pretends that epistemological frame is ontological. And I don't really need to know where that comes from because it's true, definitionally.
I'm wondering where social identities or ideas about social identities either help or hinder this.
This is a whole workshop unto itself. If epistemology is a system by which we make knowledge and our meaning, identities are sets of meanings. They are meanings that are constructed and reconstructed constantly through the inputs of us and people around us, and oftentimes in between in ways that we don't have full control over. So our identities end up being not so much shaper, but shaped like everything else.
Well, that's why I'm thinking about the positionality and
right.
how malleable is then as.
And that's where the awkward, unequal, unstable parts of friction come into play, is that if for whatever reason in the context that we're sitting in, my identity gives me some other kind of power beyond the epistemological over you, then I'm going to get to be more right than you. If I have a system and you have a system and our systems meet and I have bigger guns than you, or I have a currency that is more widely considered valuable than you, or my language is more powerful than you, all those social identities that I have are going to conduce to my epistemology overrun yours. And that occurs on what we think is like the grand scale of a colonial process. It also occurs on the individual scale.
And And I'm right with you. And struggling with this, at some point, my values say don't pull out a gun and shoot Craig Pepin and walk and
Oh, we've all thought about it.
this, like our students, I retreat into this need for an absolute at some point rather than this. Wait, this at some point it does become intellectual.
Well, that's between sort of individual lodestone, the sort of guidance for morality, intellectual sort of conceptualization of all the stuff around it and everything. And this is a really difficult thing to deal with because ultimately every human being has to make decisions about what's going to be right or wrong. At the same time, you don't have to impose those on every single election. Do, but the mix they bleed over.
But that's what's shaping our country right now, right? And that's why this is so critical.
I think Graham's making a really good point about some of the pitfalls of this, right? The one part of this discussion presupposes that we're, as educators, somehow neutral and able to point out in a sort of highly effective way these, positionalities, these differences, things like that. But at some point, we have to be honest with ourselves and our students about the fact that we bring a tremendous amount of bias to our active education. And so I do think that it's worth, I'm certainly very honest with my students about it. And I do have absolutes that I identify at the beginning. I say, these are my biases, this is my belief, and this is what you're going to hear in this class, basically whether you like it or not, right? I also think, though, too, that it's significant to have discourse on, specifically when we're looking at other things as we're constantly judging against our values and saying, well, if we're looking at a different country and they have a different practice or their legal system has different laws, and it's okay for, people here to have it, but not over here. How do you feel about that based on our sense of morality? I think those discussions are actually, but I don't, and that's part of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, the opposite end of what you're talking about is not a territory I'm speaking of where none of that comes into play. It's the starting point of analysis and moving toward advocacy. But advocacy is not absent. To pretend that we don't have biases would be ontological. To pretend that I am a neutral actor would be, I am definitionally a cipher. And that's just as flawed as coming in. And
but it's the conscious recognition and communication of the parameters or that by saying that, yes, I have these values. Yes, I have these people. I recognize that as a epistemology. I recognize this methodology.
But where to get to your question, because epistemology are enacted individually, that doesn't mean that they are not also effective on a group level, because all governance are, all laws are, are shared epistemologies, and power comes into play. There are some that have more power than others, and the hows and the whys of that are enormously important to explore. That gets beyond the I believe this and kind of conversation. It gets into, why is this thing that we believe? Why is it that the U.S. thinks that human rights should be a universal thing in a U.S. mode? Why do people sitting in the context of sitting and often think that DEI is a thing that is done across the board? Meg, Meg's still there. Your experience suggests pretty strongly that's not the case. So it's at the level of, where do our shared epistemologies become limitedly ontological? A thing that we all hold to be true, up to a point. The point of the boundaries of a country, for example, or the point of the boundaries of religious spiritual identity, or the point of the boundary of educators, or whatever it may be. That's the next step. That's the next intellectual conversation that you can't get to until you have all these others first. But too often we start down there, and we're sort of starting from a position of advocacy and then trying to backfill the analysis part, and it's less effective.
Well, your own field went through a lot of angst about this relativism.
Oh, still does?
Yeah. And the whole, because what anthropology moved from being a bunch of white guys looking at people and sort of marginalized them and exoticized them to the sort of, let's just understand there's no right or wrong. And so then you have everything in between. that I should say people are still wrestling with that academia because it isn't a simple answer to the sort of need to understand, but also the need to stake out limits or beliefs because we're humans, we have those. So the way I teach, I try to do is like transparency and the lack of sort of enforcement. But I'm not trying to dictate, but by recognition that we all would like to have our working to better articulate them in a shared way. But ultimately, can't deny people, the values that they're going to hold. The best you can hope for is get folks to articulate and understand maybe a bit better why they hold them, so they talk about them.
And one of the really effective ways to do that doesn't require a different kind of personal responsibility, vulnerability on the students. Why do you believe X, Y, or Z? Is looking at the affective operational aspects of shared epistemology.
Yeah.
These things do things to people. We do things to ourselves and to other people with them.
It's part of the groups that you were part of. Here's
Right.
the things that you share.
And looking at the power dynamics, the awkward, unequal, and stable parts that create things like power differentiations, or at the very least use those power differences to do other things. That's where you get into conversations that when a student's looking for the absolute moral, what is the right answer, wrong answer kind of situation, they're never going to be comfortable with there isn't one. But the closest that we can get is there are shared values that we operate under. That's called being in society. Those things are the result of all of this other stuff that I've been talking about, but you got to get them there. And that's not a single.
Also with epistemology, like I teach science is a wonderful epistemology for understanding natural things. It's terrible if you're trying to understand like religion or God or spirituality or something like that. It's not a very good epistemology. So, if you want absolute certainty in your life, that's a personal thing. I mean, there are epistemologies that will give that to you. But, if you want that, but what we're talking about usually are not those epistemologies unless you're talking about describing them. So it's a different sort than if you want to assert an absolute in this context, you have to use different epistemologies, different tools to try to do so. You can't just fall back.
And being aware that you're doing that is a good step in a direction. I mean, it's a hard sell to a student, to a lot of people, to say, yeah, you can hold a belief as absolute as long as you understand your absolute is limited. Your universal has an edge to it. That's a tough nut to crack.
Especially if you have another group, a social group that also believes the same in this like absolute. To an extent, obviously it's different, but I think that's one of those things that is never going to be easy, but it shouldn't necessarily be easy because part of GCU is understanding things that are hard to understand because they are not things that are part of your ontology or epistemology.
I mean, college ought to be a place where it's hard work to understand. We've only got a couple minutes left. I want to see, are there any burning questions? We haven't heard a ton from the online folks. Are there any questions burning up your fingers out there? I'll take that stony silence as a no.
Just picture him out with fingers and flinging.
Oh, there we go. Eskelson, what you got?
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
First time listening, long time caller.
Just quickly, this might not be a fair question, but in 2 weeks' time, I'm going to meet with some of our students abroad. I don't know these students. I don't think any of them have been my students, and I don't know if any of them have been your students, but they'll probably be easing into their semester, and I understand that the orientation will be bringing them through some cultural programming to introduce them to this familiar place. Mike, like what would you ask them? Like what would you sort of alert them to, or how would you kind of, assuming that they haven't had any orientation other than well, how to put this, like what kind of questions would you ask them to consider as they embark on this immersion in an unfamiliar culture? Like, let's say you just had a brief, encounter with these students at the very beginning of their semester. What might you suggest that they pay attention to or prepare themselves?
It's a good question. The first thing that pops to my mind is you're going to encounter all sorts of stuff that's going to make you go, what? And when you do, don't run away from that, but put it in your pocket until the evening. And think about it in terms of what you encountered and what assumptions you're bringing to that encounter that result in a what? Because the assumptions are their epistemologies that they're carrying around thinking they're ontological. Two parts of it. Don't have sort of knee-jerk reactionary kind of responses. And when you're trying to make sense of what you encountered, think about your frames, your assumptions, what you're bringing to the table about what is normal. Because often what is normal is what I'm used to, what I'm familiar with.
Great. Thank you.
Other questions? Thoughts?
Just want to, this can be a yes or no question. I guess I can follow up with because you, Mike Lange, you're theory guy.
Oh, I thought you said I'm very tall.
You're theory guy. I am practical, right? I can't spend 75 minutes in the classroom doing theory. So here's my question. Do you have specific materials that are not theory that you apply the theory to in order to help students understand theory?
Yeah, I never use direct theory in the classroom. The way I approach all my classes is find a good book that is outside of the student's understanding, so that they have to do some work to understand. Like friction, yeah. And then construct the classroom such that the students come to understand their role is to bring good questions and what 3% they understand into the classroom. Because your 3% are going to be different, and they're going to add up to more than 6%, weirdly. And that cultivates the humility and the vulnerability. It's okay to walk in not knowing yet, because our job is to build together. And so the theory comes out in my responding to them pointing at things in the book or trying to contextualize something in the book in relation to something we read 3 weeks ago, or something from the class, or something from the lives, or whatever it may be. That's where they bump into theory.
So would you say, okay, you just asked this question, or you just said this, so you've approached this in an epistemological way to help them understand the use of the word epistemological?
Kind of, yeah. It sort of depends on how it happens. It may be, you just bumped into some vocab, and I'll write the word. Or if they're talking about something that I can draw with that little circle diagram, I'll draw it and say, by the way, that's an epistemology. Draw this in your notebooks and label that circle the boundary between the node and the node. It happens different ways, but if they know that they're allowed to be vulnerable and humble by not needing a right answer to make noises come out of their face in the classroom, they take part. And then when they do, when the response from me is, wow, you just bumped into a smart thing, that cultivates more confidence in more exploration. And the theory in their minds has come from them, not from me. They ran into it. I just put a label. I just gave you that calculator for it. So yeah, my classes are all about practical. It's maybe a different kind of practical from what is in Lange, but I don't teach with theory as such. We read good books. Ethnographies are particularly valuable for that because they happen to dwell in this realm, and that's obviously from my disciplinary backgrounds. That's a happy place for me. But any book that allows students to try to make connections and bump into theories is a good book. It's fun. We're over time. I don't know how strictly you wanted to be about to.
Don't be too strict. We're going to stick to one.
I'd love to teach.
Yeah.
And so we probably do have a class block on that. So
yeah, exactly. So you got there's certainly some more questions that I don't have. and we kind of later on. But I'll point out that first of all, you suggest one of the things. Some of these suggest we should reverse more reverse part checking. So it's different.
Oh,
It's so yeah, you're very thing too. Another thing that we haven't had a chance to fully explore is that on one hand, you talk about advocacy. You talked about advocacy. Analysis starts at advocacy. The last element of global culture is like initiating, developing interactions with culturally different others. Looks like there's an element of advocacy.
there is. Yeah, if you remember the conversations we had about that way back when, yeah, that's why.
Right. So there's something about that. The other thing I'll simply point out is that actually the first, second, and fourth criteria on this group not very, very closely to the first two criteria for diversity. And there's a lot of overlap between the students. So many of us are asking students to do fundamentally similar things. And what's interesting, particularly interested in me thinking of these on a large scale, is the extent to which there are criteria neutral. This, I don't much detail about this. Say that for another time. Meg is going to chat on DEI specifically after spring break. So I'm going to go over to your trust in these issues to encourage you to mark that down your calendar. So we post calendar's about to go out. I can get all the workshops now in front of me at time. So that full calendar makes sense. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for coming along. Yeah, looking for that.
Thanks on time and for look for more of these sound